Hello, good afternoon friends. Today in this session we are going to discuss about our MS41 paper, which is working capital management. In this particular session we are going to discuss about this working capital management principles and approaches. What are the approaches which a firm should adopt while deciding upon its working capital management policy. To tell us more about this working capital management principle and approaches, today we have with us Professor P.N. Varshney, who is a professor of economics, who was a professor of economics at Delhi University. So today he would be discussing about the various issues pertaining to the working capital management. In the first session we would be talking about the principles regarding the working capital management, and in the second session we are going to talk about the principles about the new initiatives which the banks are undertaking for financing the working capital requirement of the industries and the firm. Over to you, sir.
Friends, today we are going to discuss one very important aspect of financial management, that is the working capital management. Its importance can be judged from the fact that many enterprises fail in achieving their objective because of the shortage of the working capital. You know that when a firm is started, two types of capital is required. One for initial investment and secondly for working capital. Initial investment, as you know very well, is the capital which is required for investment in the fixed assets. Working capital is the capital which is required for investment in the circulating assets or the current assets. Why they are called current assets? Because they do not remain in the same form forever. They are intended to change their form from one form to another form. For example, we start with the cash. For our day-to-day requirement we need cash, so cash balances are required. These balances enable us to purchase raw materials. Raw materials have to be converted into semi-manufactured goods, ultimately in manufactured goods. Manufactured goods are sold to the customers, and our trade receivables, our accounts receivables arise. Ultimately the accounts receivables are converted into cash. So these are the three types of assets: cash, inventories and receivables, in which we have to block funds. And the funds which are blocked in these three current assets constitute what is called the working capital, or what we call technically gross working capital. Gross working capital is financed through trade credit also, the credit granted to us by our suppliers. So to that extent we need not worry about raising the funds for working capital purposes. This is called net working capital. The funds which we need for financing the current assets, net of current liabilities, that is the creditors, trade creditors and creditors for expenses, etc., is called net working capital. Now the problem is how to quantify this amount of net working capital. This is the first very important problem. Many businesses fail because the promoters or the entrepreneurs are unable to quantify the exact amount of working capital which is required. Sometimes they are short of working capital and they have to stop their activities, or their business comes to a standstill. After quantification of the working capital, amount of working capital, arises the question, next question of the source from which we have to raise the funds. Here also a very fundamental issue is to be tackled. Should we raise funds from the long-term sources or should we raise funds from the short-term sources? There are advantages and disadvantages of both. I will discuss later. After we decide the source, then comes the question of on what terms and conditions we have to raise. That is the interest rates and other terms and conditions. What should be the quantum of finance that we have to raise? And the most important thing is timely availability of finance. If finance is not received in time, it will jeopardize our efforts or our business objective. So these are important issues which are to be decided by the entrepreneur, by the promoters or the entrepreneur, while deciding the quantum of finance which is to be raised, while deciding the sources from which we have to raise the finance, and on what terms and conditions we have to raise the finance. I am going to discuss some of these issues, basic issues, today. The first question is, how to calculate the exact requirement of working capital? Of course, the quantum will depend on the business activity, that is the level of production or level of turnover. Well, we presume a certain level of production, intended level of production, or we presume a certain level, intended level of turnover. This will be our turnover, this will be, so much will be our production. For so much of production, how much working capital is required. Now, for this purpose, a detailed analysis of each component of working capital is undertaken. Firstly, let us understand that the requirement of working capital depends on the duration of the operating cycle. By operating cycle will mean what is the length of time within which one operation is complete. From cash back to the position of cash, how much time does it take? This operating cycle is different for different industries, different trades, etc. Often you find a contrast between the operating cycle, a difference in the operating cycle in our day-to-day life. In news vendor, when he drops a newspaper at our homes, he does not collect every day. So the operating cycle of the news vendor is about 30 days or 35 days when he comes to collect the money from us. On the other hand, the vegetable vendor, he does not grant us credit, and so he raises money every day. His operating cycle is just of 24 hours. You can just imagine that the news vendor has to employ a much larger amount of working capital in his business than a vegetable vendor, treating or considering that the turnover, the daily turnover of both of them is the same. Both of them are selling goods for 200 rupees every day, but in case of one, that is the vegetable vendor, the amount of working capital would be very small as compared to the news vendor. He has to realize money from the customers after 30 days. This is the difference. This is the difference because of the length of the operating cycle. So now we are going to calculate the working capital, amount of working capital, and in this calculation we have to keep in mind, number one, the length of the operating cycle, number two, what is the level of activity for which you want to calculate. Firstly, a minimum cash balance is to be maintained in every business, and this depends on our past experience. What balance was sufficient for us during past. Then the cost of the raw material. Cost of the raw material will depend on the consumption rate. What is our daily consumption rate? What is the time lag in procuring fresh arrivals and contingencies, etc. And what is the price of the raw material? So we multiply these three things. For example, if the daily consumption of 50 units, time lag is of 5 days, it means 250 units we have to procure. Price of per unit we have to take into account, plus some consideration for the safety stock. We have to keep some safety stock also. In this way we find that about 270 units are required, and suppose the cost of 1 unit is 10 rupees, so 2,700 rupees will be the requirement of working capital for raw materials purposes. Similarly, work in progress. How much time is taken in converting the raw material into final product? What is the value of the raw material used during this period? How much wages we pay and other expenses we incur? All these things we have to calculate in order to find out investment in work in progress. Finished goods, third component, cost of goods purchased or procured or produced is locked up, and hence working capital requirement is required for the period our final goods remains with us. Here one point is to be taken into account. While considering the investment of funds in working capital, we need not take the selling price into consideration. Selling price includes our profit also. So we have to take the cost price of the raw material, the stock in trade, whether we are producing within the company or we are purchasing from outside. And the carrying cost also. When we carry the stock, then some cost is incurred in carrying the stocks. That is the rent also, insurance also, etc. Receivables, our debtors. How much amount is blocked up in debtors? This is also taken into account. This is the third component. And here we find that the cost of debtors is to be taken into account. Cost of debtor again excludes profit. Because when we will realize the full amount from debtors, then we will realize the profit. We are not incurring any working capital in the profit which we are going to realize from the debtors. So all receivables are to be valued at the cost price, whatever investment we have made in the goods sold to the customers. These items are to be aggregated, these amounts are to be aggregated, and thereafter we give a consideration or reduction for creditors for purchases. How much credit we are getting from the purchaser, from the suppliers, our creditors, for the purchases and for the expenses, etc. Here I would like to mention that in some businesses there is a practice of getting the raw materials on credit and selling the final product on cash basis. If these are the practices in a particular business, then you will find that the requirement of working capital, net working capital, is reduced considerably. You just consider the case of public utilities. And in the public utilities, we can mention the case of railways. You know, the railways realize the sale proceeds of their tickets much in advance. By advance reservation, they realize the proceeds in cash much in advance of the commencement of journey. But they are paying salaries to the staff at the end of the month. The bills to electricity boards, they are paying at the end of the month, or whenever the bills comes, then they make the payment. So their payments are at the end of the month or end of a certain period. And the realization from the customers is much in advance. Nowadays, you know, the 60 days advance booking is there, which is going to be extended to 90 days. So in such businesses, the requirement of working capital is minimized to a large extent. Thereafter, some safety margins to be maintained, which is percentage which is expressed as a percentage of total current assets. Depreciation on fixed assets, though it is a business expense, but it is excluded from calculation of working capital requirement because it is a non-cash expense. We do not need money to finance this expenditure. So in this way I have told you certain basic things, certain basic principles how to calculate the net requirement of working capital. Two things are there. One, the profits on goods sold are to be excluded, and number two, non-cash expenses like depreciation to be excluded. in this area, a strategy can be adopted to avail trade credit to the maximum extent possible. In other words, we can say that the entrepreneur should try to procure as best terms from the suppliers of goods, suppliers of raw material as possible, and thereby you can reduce your requirement of working capital. You must have read recently the railways are going to extend this advance reservation from 60 days to 90 days. Now, by increasing this advance reservation period, they are going to increase inflow of cash, and so their working capital requirement will be further reduced. So, if there is any possibility of availing trade credit, availing any trade period, whatever the period is, this period for payment is given to us, this should be properly availed of. Secondly, the period of credit which is to be granted to our customers should be reduced if it is possible, if it is not detrimental to our sales. If we can stand in competition with our competitors, then we can try to reduce the credit period. In other words, we can intensify our collection efforts and reduce the collection period, collection time. It is to be also noted that we should not follow very strict collection policies, collection practices. Because if we follow a very strict collection practice, or we do not grant liberal credit to our customers, we may not be able to withstand the competition from our competitors. So while we decide the credit period for our customers, we should be very realistic. We should neither be too liberal toward our customers, nor should be very harsh towards our customers. We should keep in mind that we are in a competitive world. We have to face the competition from our competitors, and in this regard, whatever appropriate credit period or collection efforts are needed, we should undertake to minimize our net working capital requirement. After this basic exercise comes the second question, that is approaches to financing working capital. Three approaches are there, well-known approaches: the matching approach, the conservative approach, and the aggressive approach. You know very well that long-term sources have their own advantages as compared to the short-term sources, while short-term sources are also having some merit. In case of the long-term sources, namely capital and long-term debt through debt instruments or through loans from the banks, etc., we raise funds which are retained by business over a longer period of time. There is no risk or no anxiety for early repayment. This is the greatest virtue. We enjoy the funds, we can employ the funds within the business over a sufficiently long period of time, but there may be high cost of such funds. At certain periods of time, we will not be able to fully employ these funds. The funds may remain idle for some period also. This is the greatest disadvantage. Short-term funds, sometimes they are cheaper than long-term funds. There is the flexibility of repayment. When funds are not needed, you can repay the funds to the supplier, to the creditor, and you can minimize your cost. But on the other hand, there is the greatest risk of non-availability when need for funds arises. Which is the virtue or which is the advantage in case of the long-term funds? So when we balance the advantage and disadvantage of these two, we come to a balanced approach, that is a matching approach. Permanent working capital a part of the permanent working capital is to be raised through long-term sources, and the rest of the working capital can be raised through short-term sources. This is the reason why you must have seen that when companies prepare the cost of the project, at the time of starting a project, they prepare a statement showing cost of the project and sources of financing it. Among the sources of financing it, they show the various sources through which they are raising the funds. Largely the long-term funds are there for project cost, and the cost of the project includes one item that is called margin for working capital. This margin for working capital is meant to serve this permanent part of the working capital. This is the amount which we are raising from long-term sources to meet our working capital requirement on a permanent basis. So, in businesses we have to keep this golden principle in mind. Don't depend exclusively on short-term sources. Rather, finance a part of working capital, rather the permanent working capital. The working capital will always remain employed in the firm. It is called permanent working capital. Apart from permanent working capital, there is the fluctuating part of the working capital. So the permanent part of the working capital must be, a part of this must be raised through permanent sources, long-term sources. Now what should be the part, what should be the extent to which long-term source should be employed for permanent working capital requirement? This differs from firm to firm, from industry to industry, or from the perception of the businessman himself. You must be knowing very well that the own funds are very essential because they serve as a cushion for borrowed funds, that is the creditors. Higher the own funds, higher the borrowing capacity. In case of the companies, Section 293, subsection 1 of the Companies Act lays down the limit up to which a company can borrow without taking into consideration, without taking the approval of the company at the annual general meeting. And this limit is aggregate of the paid up capital and free reserves. And in this limit, banks, temporary funds from banks, temporary loans from banks are excluded. So you can understand very well that higher is the amount of paid up capital and free reserves, that is the owned funds of the company, higher will become the normal or the ordinary borrowing capacity of the firm. In this way, we can understand the significance of the owned funds. When we have to borrow funds from outside, we have to raise our own funds simultaneously. Borrowed funds carry what is called financial risk. Rate of interest may be high than our rate of return on capital, and in this way the company may or the firm may not be able to pay interest out of the revenue generated by it. This is the greatest drawback. This is the greatest, we can say, limitation, or we can say risk involved. When the company is borrowing, the borrowings may be against the goods or securities or against receivables. Receivables means the current assets. I have told you receivables are our debtors to whom we have sold the goods. So against current assets of receivables, we can also borrow from different sources. When we borrow against goods and securities, such goods and securities may be the primary security or collateral security, and in addition there may be the guarantees also. Guarantees are given by a third party for the repayment of the loan. Collateral security means security in addition to the primary security. Primary security is that security which is purchased out of the loans taken from the creditors. Now, in addition to the primary security, sometimes the lenders require that the firm should also give a collateral security, additional security apart from the primary security. Existing asset is to be pledged or mortgaged with the lender in addition to the primary security. This is called collateral security. Now, briefly I will come to various strategies for managing the working capital, or the three types of current assets. As I told you, the problem of working capital management is how to reduce the amount of net working capital, how to minimize the need for working capital. This is our primary concern. For this purpose, we have to act on all the three fronts. How to manage our current assets in very efficient manner. This is our requirement. Cash. How to minimize cash, cash balances kept with the firm without jeopardizing the operations of the firm. Keeping excess funds with us also not desirable. Shortage of funds is also not desirable, will lead to difficulties. So there should be an ideal balance which we have to maintain. And this ideal balance, or we can say whether the balance, cash balance with us is in excess of our requirement or is deficient to our requirements, this can be judged by preparing a cash budget. So cash budget is a forecast, a sort of forecast or estimate about the future periods, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, divided into subparts. Some weekly budgets may be prepared, daily budgets may be prepared. For each period we estimate the cash inflows and cash outflows. And ultimately we find out whether we will be having shortage of funds or surplus funds. Wisdom lies in utilizing the short-term funds, surplus of the short-term funds outside the firm and earn an income. If we find that some funds are surplus with us, we should employ outside for a temporary period, for as short a period as a few days or few weeks. And if we are having shortage of funds, then we should plan the funds in advance. Then we can have, if we arrange the funds on the basis of a cash budget in advance, then we will be securing the most convenient terms from the lenders. What is the difference between we can say emergency borrowings and we can say the convenient borrowings or the planned borrowings? In case of the planned borrowings or convenient borrowings, we can negotiate with so many lenders and can negotiate the best terms for the firm. But if without a cash budget, an emergency arises and we have to borrow funds from outside, then we have to accept the terms and conditions imposed by the lenders and we have to pay a higher price. So far as the cash budget is concerned, these are the important points, apart from speedy recovery from debtors. I have told you that our collection effort should not be slacking. We should try to reduce the collection period. How to reduce the collection period? There are several methods. Several methods or practices can be adopted to expedite our collection from the debtors. But keep in mind one thing, we should not jeopardize our relationship. We should not spoil our relationship with the customers. We should not be really harsh with our customers, and we should decide the credit terms keeping in view this mind. Similarly, inventory management. In case of the inventory management, The best principle is, or we can say the most accepted principle is, that we should try to minimize investment in inventories without facing the risk of being stock out. We should not face the out of stock situation, and at the same time we should have a minimum investment in inventories. Because excessive inventories are of no use to us, or we can rather say there is a carrying cost, there is the investment in inventories, so our cost increases if we have higher inventories. There are various techniques used in inventory management. For example, economic order quantity. We determine the quantity which we should buy at one particular time. Then when should we place the next order? That is the reorder point we have to decide. And thirdly, we have to decide the quantum of safety stock. Because emergency arises, then we should not be out of stock. These three things we have to follow in order to minimize investment in inventories. Lastly, receivables management. Collection policies and practices should not be too harsh or too lenient, as I have already emphasized. Harsh credit terms means expending sales by liberal credit, not expending sales by liberal credit terms. Here I would like to mention that some of the firms have got an edge over other competitors. Either they have got a name, a brand name in the product concerned, or they have got a reputation, or their management is very well-known management, very competent management in the eyes of the people. Such firms can dictate terms which are not offered by other firms. They can have their own terms. They have not to go by industry norms. You must have seen, in off-season, many manufacturers of fans, they offer discount. But some of the firms, some of the manufacturers do not offer discount because they have got a brand name in their product. Some of the firms offer various concessions, or we can say discounts, or they offer prices, etc., to attract the customers. But some firms, other firms, do not offer. So this depends whether you are offering discounts, or having harsh credit terms, or you are offering various concessions to the customers or not. This all depends on the place you have occupied in the industry concerned. Too liberal credit terms is not necessary may yield maximum profits. And for that purpose, credit policy is determined taking into account the various taking into account the cost and profits of a particular trade policy. How much profits you will earn if you follow a certain credit policy. If you grant a credit for a certain period and sales amount to such and such quantum, what will be the profit to us? So these types of strategies can be followed in managing the three important current assets, and thereby, if we can reduce the quantum of current assets, naturally our gross working capital will be reduced, requirement for gross working capital will be reduced, and as I suggested that we should try to avail credit period granted by our suppliers, or we should try to have as much trade credit as possible, so we can increase trade credit, or we can say current liabilities. By reducing the current assets and by increasing current liabilities, we can narrow down the gap which is called net working capital. I think this is the strategy which is to be followed by businesses in order to manage working capital in a very efficient manner.
In this particular case, you have talked about managing the working capital at the micro level, at the firm level. Now, but when we talk about the working capital at the macro level, does the backward and the forward integration of the industries also affect the working capital in any way? Just for example, let us talk about a cement manufacturing unit. Now, in case of cement manufacturing unit, the major part of the cost involved is the raw material, that is the lime and the coal. Now, if that particular cement manufacturing unit is going for backward integration, that implies that if it is going for leasing mines of limestone and coal and other raw material which is used in the manufacturing process of the cement, then automatically, if they are owning that particular mine, so the working capital requirement would be far less as compared to those companies which buy the raw material from outside. Similarly, when we are talking about the forward integration, that means when a company is manufacturing a certain product which is used for manufacturing another product, then also the working capital is going to be affected in some way or the other. In this particular case, when we are going for forward integration, let us say in the manufacturing of detergents. In the manufacturing of detergents, one of the major components is LAB, linear alkyl benzene. Now, that is prepared by a separate unit, and the detergents are prepared by a separate unit. In this case, if the manufacturer of the LAB, that is linear alkyl benzene, plans to go for forward integration, then what happens is the amount, and if this particularly if the LAB is sold on credit terms of say 60 days, then what happens is, if this particular manufacturing is going for forward integration, then it can use the same product, the linear alkyl benzene, for manufacturing of detergents, and these detergents can be sold in the market on a credit period of 30 days. Why there is a difference between 30 or 60 days? In this particular case, since the consumers of the linear alkyl benzene would be very few, they would be in a position to dictate the terms on the manufacturers of the LAB. Whereas in the case of detergents, since the supply of the detergent are few and the consumers or the wholesalers or the retailers are many, they can dictate the terms on the wholesalers and retailers and extend a period of only 30 days, whereas they can take a credit period of 60 days from the manufacturers of the linear alkyl benzene. So when we are talking at the macro level, many of the mergers and acquisitions which you are seeing over these days, one of the basic reasons, apart from the harnessing the various synergies which are involved in these mergers and acquisitions, one of the reasons for the higher level of mergers and acquisition is to reduce down the amount of the working capital which is required. That is one of the reasons. There are many other host of the synergies. Let us talk about the recent acquisition of the Chorus by Tatas. In this, one of the synergies which is going to be there is that since the Tatas are having an access to the various iron ore, because most of the iron ore mines are located in India. So what will happen is the Chorus group as a whole will have an access to the raw material. Now, if let us take a scenario where both these entities are separate entities. In that particular case, what is going to happen? The Chorus group will have to have a higher amount of working capital. Now, if there is a merged entity which is having access to the iron ore, in this particular case, the merged entity will have a lesser requirement of the working capital as compared to both of the separate entities. So, when we are talking about the working capital, the mergers and acquisitions will also decrease the operating cycle, as the sir has already mentioned in his lecture, that the various other synergies are going to be there apart from the operating cycle, the access to the raw material and all that. So, sir has talked about the working capital at the micro level. about the gross and net working capital, the quantum of the working capital, and the duration of the operating cycle. Now,
here one point I would like to raise. You have mentioned about the profit, the working capital requirement in case of an integrated firm is reduced because of the profit. I have also told that the profit is not financed. We have not to make a provision for finance for the profit of the firm. So here there are two firms are there in the same industry. So firm B has not to finance the profit of firm A. This is the point.
So in this particular session we have talked about the various principles regarding the working capital management, what are the approaches towards the working capital management, and in our next session we are going to talk about the new initiatives which the various banks are taking, the various financial institutions are taking regarding the working capital. Thank you.